And I think we have to have these discussions, both sides have to be heard and we got to figure out how to move forward. The one sort of dispute we have, like in a court of law, you got the facts and you hear both sides and someone says this is a fact, someone says this fact is, and I think there is something here that is in contention, and that is whether or not the Remain in Mexico policy enriched the cartels. And this chart's kind of similar to not as famous as Senator Johnson's chart, but similar in the sense that you can see sort of Remain in Mexico, the encounters come down to about 20,000 or so. Here they're up around 300,000. So you've got essentially a tenfold increase. And so if we say, and we understand that cartels make money by getting people across the border, it seems hard to me to argue that when you have 300,000 encounters that they wouldn't make more money here than they make here. I just find it really hard. And so I'd like to give each of you a chance to respond to that. Why don't we start with Ken Cuccinelli?
So, Mr. Chairman, you're right. And the CBP Intel assessments, we don't audit the cartels, right? But the Intel folks who track what they do as best we can believe that they're financing the money they were making on human trafficking probably past drug trafficking in the Biden administration. So the chart here serves as a proxy to money they were making from this
If we wanted to know more for certain, and it's an estimate because it's all done illegally, is there someone who makes an estimate of this, somebody in our Intel who is looking at this that would be able to, we can bring here?
Intel shop is your best.
You think they make an estimate month by month on what they think they're making? So it's still going to be an estimate, but if we wanted further information on it, we could ask the CBP.
Correct.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Arthur?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Senator. And it's not just the cartels, it's also the smuggling organizations. It's always important to keep the two separate. Smugglers actually do the heavy lifting. The cartels then skim the cream off of the top to let those individuals cross what they call their territories. And then you've also got the human traffickers that can feed in that environment as well. So when you're talking about the money that's flowed into the pockets of the cartels, right there. But it's not just simply from taking fees or shaking down migrants. When you send large numbers of people across the border, you create what Chief Rodney Scott, who's the CBP designee, commissioner designee, called controllable corridors. So you send a bunch of kids and adults over, Border Patrol rushes over to get them, and then it creates a void in the line that the cartels can use to run the drugs to the United States. Absolutely crucial part of this. They're feasting right now.
So you would agree that the argument that when there are more encounters and more traffic going across, it would be proportional to more profits?
Absolutely.
Not the reverse.
Absolutely.
So when you have Remain in Mexico down here, it's a little hard to argue they're making more money when there's a lot less people going across the border as opposed to here.
Absolutely. And there's also a lot less human carnage, Senator, because Ken had talked about this, but Doctors Without Borders did a report in 2017 in which they estimated that about 68+% of all migrants are physically abused during that illegal journey to the United States. Just under a third of all women are sexually abused. When you cut down the number of people coming, you cut down the number of crimes.
Thank you. Mr. Isaacson.
On that chart, I would point out that that low point there was the beginning of COVID, and just before that, Remain in Mexico was almost done. Between then and when it was actually terminated, you had about 4,000 or 5,000 people put in that program over all of those months, so it was hardly in existence.
Say a little bit louder, please.
Sure. Remain in Mexico was hardly in existence from the time that COVID began until it was actually terminated when Joe Biden was inaugurated. Maybe 4,000 or 5,000 people put in the program in that entire space. So it was not much of a deterrent at that point. Title 42 had really been what was on people's minds if they were thinking of crossing the border.
Basically, you're making the argument that quite a bit of the dip is COVID. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, at the bottom there, it's COVID and Title 42, yeah.
Senator, I'll note the fact that the pandemic wasn't declared until March the 20th, 2020. You can see the bottom of your chart there.
Right.
And one of the things that opponents of Title 42 would say is that, the numbers were inflated because of recidivism. So I would gently disagree with Mr. Isaacson. I'd say that when you look at that right there, you get people stopped under 42, they get turned back, and then they just come around because there is no deterrent effect. There's no punishment for re-entering under Title 42. There is one with MPP.
So if, the Trump administration is saying they want to correct some of the problem of all the people who have been paroled and millions of people are here, one of the big complaints is that their hearing won't come up for 1,000 days or whatever, 3 or 4 years. Does the president have the power, if he wished to simply say all the hearings are going to be in 1 month and designate enough people to hear these? I mean, could there be, if you basically came up with a rule and said Cuba's eligible and Venezuela's eligible, nobody else is eligible, and the proceeding will now be that you show up and someone's going to ask you where you're from, and if you can prove you're from Cuba or Venezuela, you're going to get a hearing. If you don't, your hearing's over and concluded, and there's a much speeding up of the process. We'll start with Mr. Cuccinelli. Do you think that power exists? Would that be something you'd recommend?
It's a good question. It's probably a close question about whether that power exists. It would certainly be litigated, of course, because everything will be litigated. But I believe there is already existing a lot more authority by the president to not consider asylum petitions from various countries. And whether that's, excuse me, by the third country regulation being reinstated. So if you pass through Mexico and you don't apply for asylum there, you don't get to apply for asylum here. That was extremely effective, but it was lost in the wash statistically of COVID. We do have, we're looking at one program, but there were other programs, for example, expedited removal was also used more heavily starting in 2019. So it's hard sometimes to disentangle the data. I think the DHS report about the success of MPP is your best conclusive source of information for how that was successful and the fact that it was very successful in keeping people out and deterring others.
On the same lines, Mr. Arthur, if the definitional change can be controlled by the president, would this help with the expediting of all these cases instead of 1,000 days going back to the 36 days you talked about? If we just make the job easier, that we don't have to go, and I frankly think most of these people by definition should be ineligible for the process. And that's what we should do moving forward. But even looking backwards, we tell people your detention hearings next month, and you're supposed to go back to where you were brought in, where you came in illegally. If that's in Texas, you're supposed to go back. It would be a directive for people, at least those who are going to voluntarily do as they're told, to go back. And it would also be a law that if they break that law and you tell them they got to be there in 2 months and they're not there, I would think then you have grounds for no hearing. They've broken a law that is the law. Now they're would be immediately deported wherever they are. But what do you think about the president's power to have a definitional change, and whether or not that we could expedite or move their dates up on detention hearings?
Sure, absolutely. The first thing it's important to note, many of you may not be aware of this, the law already says asylum claims are supposed to be heard from beginning to end in 180 days. So they've just ignored Congress's admonition with respect to that.
Say that again, between 2 and 180?
No, within 180 days, from beginning to end, 180 days.
Okay.
But the other part of that is that the way that the asylum statute is written, it has 2 parts. One, anybody can apply. And then there's a separate section for who can be granted. So the potential argument is, yes, the president could say anybody can apply, but only these people can be granted. Now it's going to get litigated. It was litigated the last time, never got up to the Supreme Court. President used his 212F powers to prevent people from applying for asylum. Mr. Cuccinelli knows all about that. But it got to the Ninth Circuit. It was stopped at the Ninth Circuit. And respectfully, toward the judges, it was an awful decision. It was just poorly reasoned. Had it gone to the Supreme Court, I think it would have gotten overturned. Basically, though, that's what the Biden administration is doing right now. Mr. Isaacson has referred to that. We're not allowing those individuals to apply for asylum with exceptions. But they came too late to that conclusion.
Mr. Isaacson?
Well, I mean, sure, if you wanted to get you got 1.5 million or more asylum cases pending. That's a matter of appropriations. You have to have the capacity. You have to have people, no matter what you're doing. Now, banning certain countries, I personally don't think the statute backs that up. 212F appears to be usable to block someone from coming to the United States, but once they're here asking for protection, that's a different case. So I think this would be litigated to death if you were to try that.
I think the hearing has been useful and very informative. Thank you all for coming. We're going to vote here in just a couple of minutes. Before we adjourn, if anybody's got a pressing question, we'll start with Senator Peters. Anything else? Anybody else on this side?
Yeah.
Senator Moreno.
Yeah, if I could just add, so just the